The man who owned everything. The dinner cost $412, and Marcus Hale ate it alone. He sat at the long dining table on the 43rd floor of the Meridian Tower. The Chicago skyline spread out behind him like a painting someone had commissioned specifically for this apartment, specifically for this view, specifically for a man of this magnitude. The lamb was from a farm in Colorado. The wine was from a vineyard in Napa he had once considered buying. The table could seat 14. Tonight, as most nights, only one chair had a plate in front of it. His phone was face down. His tablet was propped against a water glass, cycling through the evening's Bloomberg feed. Interest rate speculation, a shipping disruption in Rotterdam, a mid-cap tech firm missing earnings by 11%. Marcus read without reading, the way a man reads when the information is less important than the act of remaining informed. He was 54 years old, in excellent health, and had not sat through a full dinner with another human being in approximately 3 weeks. He had not noticed. The call came at 8:47 p.m. from his deputy chief of staff, a woman named Patricia Wren, who had worked for him for 9 years and who knew by now the exact register of voice required to interrupt his evenings without being fired. "Marcus," she said, "I'm sending you something. I need you to look at it before it gets bigger." He turned the phone over. The link she sent opened to a video clip, already past 200,000 views, posted by someone who had been walking past a building on Carlisle Street in Wicker Park at just past 2 in the morning. The clip was 19 seconds long. It showed the front entrance of a 6-story apartment building, and in front of that entrance, sitting on a stack of cardboard boxes and a rolling suitcase, was a woman. She was young, early 30s maybe. She was wearing scrubs, the blue-green kind that hospital workers wear, with a lanyard still looped around her neck. Her hair was pulled back and slightly undone, the way hair comes undone after a 12-hour shift. She was sitting very straight, one hand resting flat on her knee, the other hand wrapped around a sleeping child pressed against her chest. A small girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, wearing a unicorn print nightgown, her cheek resting against her mother's shoulder, with the total, bone-deep surrender of a child who has never once doubted that her mother will keep her safe. The woman on the screen was not crying. That was the thing Marcus kept coming back to. She was not crying, was not shouting, was not performing distress for the camera. She was sitting with the stillness of someone who had been still before, who had sat through worse than this and come out the other side by refusing to break. Behind her, a man in a polo shirt with the Vertex Property Solutions logo stood near the door, not looking at her, scrolling his phone. 2 cardboard boxes were stacked unevenly, and on the top box, someone had written in black marker the word kitchen. In the upper right corner of the building's entrance, partially visible in the frame, was the Hale Capital Residential logo, a stylized H in navy blue, the same H that appeared on the letterhead of 47,000 pieces of correspondence per year, the same H Marcus had approved in a design meeting 8 years ago, choosing it in 30 seconds because he liked the way it anchored the top of the page. Marcus set the phone down. He picked it up again. The video had 214,000 views. The top comment read, "This is America." A sleeping baby on a sidewalk while the building's owner is probably on a yacht. He was not on a yacht. He was on the 43rd floor of a building he also owned, eating lamb that had been driven 2,000 miles, watching a 19-second video of a woman and her child who used to live in one of his buildings and who now, as of 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, did not. He called Patricia back. "Get communications on it," he said. "Standard holding statement. We're investigating the circumstances. We take tenant welfare seriously, the usual framework. And get me the property file for Carlisle Street. Full file. Operations, maintenance logs, management contacts. I want it before I go to sleep." Patricia said she would have it within the hour. Marcus finished his dinner. Or he finished moving food around his plate until finishing seemed like a reasonable conclusion. He drank the last of the wine. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and stood with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city below. The grid of streetlights, the expressway, a slow red river of taillights, the neighborhoods stacked against each other like layers of sediment, each one a different version of Chicago. Somewhere out there, past the expressway and the river and the neighborhoods he could name from money, was Wicker Park. And somewhere in Wicker Park, on or near Carlisle Street, was a woman in blue-green scrubs sitting on the sidewalk with a sleeping child in her arms. Marcus Hale had built or acquired 38,000 residential units in 11 cities. He had been cited in Forbes 3 times, profiled in the Tribune once, and had appeared at a Senate subcommittee hearing on housing affordability, where he had argued, clearly and with well-prepared data, that private capital was essential to solving America's housing supply problem. He believed this. He had believed it for 30 years. He stood at the window for a long time, longer than he usually stood anywhere. When the property file arrived at 10:14 p.m., he opened it and read the first 3 pages. The building at 2214 Carlisle Street was a 72-unit residential property acquired by Hale Capital in 2019, currently managed under contract by Vertex Property Solutions, with a portfolio management rating of 87 out of 100, above average. Occupancy was at 94%. Net operating income for the current fiscal year was tracking 4 points above projection. He closed the file and went to bed. He did not sleep. He lay in the dark of a bedroom that was larger than some people's entire apartments and stared at the ceiling and tried to locate the specific thing that was keeping him awake. It was not guilt. He had not yet assembled enough information for guilt. It was not anger. It was something quieter and more stubborn, something that sat in the chest like a stone that has been there long enough that you stopped noticing it, and then someone turned a light on, and there it was. The woman had not been crying. That was it. That was the thing. Marcus Hale had been in business for 30 years. He had seen distress performed, leveraged, weaponized. He had been in negotiations where the other party wept on cue. He had watched PR campaigns built entirely on the architecture of sympathy. He knew what a person looked like when they were performing for an audience. That woman had not been performing. She had been sitting on a sidewalk at 2 in the morning with her child in her arms, and she had been as still and as straight back to someone who had already used up all the energy she had left for breaking down, and had made a decision, somewhere before the camera arrived, to simply remain. Marcus did not know her name yet. He did not know anything about her yet, but he lay awake in his $400 a night bed in his own building and could not stop seeing her sitting on the concrete, and the child's cheek against her shoulder, and the word kitchen written in black marker on a cardboard box. He had built 38,000 apartments. He was not sure, lying there in the dark at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, that he had ever actually thought about who lived in them. That was the first crack. Not a collapse. Marcus Hale was not a man who collapsed. But a crack, thin and precise, running along a foundation he had believed was solid. He was awake at 5:30, not because he set an alarm, because somewhere around 4 in the morning his brain had stopped pretending and started working. He padded barefoot to his home office, the kind of room that existed to signal seriousness. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a standing desk with 2 monitors, a framed copy of the first lease agreement Hale Capital had ever signed in 1994 for a 12-unit building in Evanston that he had bought with borrowed money and a level of reckless confidence that he could no longer entirely recognize in himself. His father had co-signed that loan. His father had said, the day they closed, that real estate was not a business, but a discipline. And that discipline required the systematic removal of sentiment from decision-making. Marcus had written that down. He sat at the standing desk without standing and opened the Vertex Property Management portal with his master access credentials. Credentials he had not used in approximately 2 years because there were people whose job it was to access portals. The Carlisle Street building came up immediately. Unit 4C. Tenant of record, D. Marsh. Lease start date, October 2018. 6 years. He clicked into the payment history first, because that was how his brain organized itself. Facts first, narrative second. 6 years of on-time payments rendered in a clean table of green check marks. Every month, without exception, from October 2018 through August of this year. Then, in September, a flag. A small red indicator marked Payment Processing Error. Then another in September, a different flag, Notice Issued. Then October, Eviction Proceedings Initiated. Case resolved. Resolved. That was the word the system used. Marcus scrolled to the notes attached to the case. The notes were in the abbreviated language of property management software, but he could read the bones of it. The tenant had submitted 3 separate written complaints about a non-functioning online payment portal. The first complaint was logged September 4th, the second, September 11th, the third, September 18th. All 3 were marked in a small gray font, Case Status, Non-Responsive. He sat with that for a moment. Non-responsive. It was the kind of language that made sense from the inside of a system. It had a technical definition, a workflow trigger, a downstream action. From the outside of the system, from a sidewalk on Carlisle Street at 2 in the morning, non-responsive meant something completely different. It meant, we stopped listening to you, and then we labeled your silence as your fault. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Behind him, on the credenza beneath the window, was a cardboard box. Medium-sized, sealed with brown tape, labeled in his own handwriting, Dad. Personal. It had been sitting there since the estate settlement almost a year ago. He had meant to go through it, and had not. He had walked past it every day and noted its existence with the efficiency of a man who has been trained not to stop for things he cannot immediately categorize. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked away. He read the Vertex contract summary next. The management agreement gave Vertex full operational authority over tenant communications, maintenance scheduling, and eviction proceedings within defined thresholds. Vertex was contractually required to notify Hale Capital of any eviction action involving a tenant with more than 4 years of residency. Marcus ran a search. There was no notification on file for Unit 4C, 2214 Carlisle Street. Either Vertex had failed to send the notification, or someone had received it and filed it somewhere he could not immediately find. Either way, a woman who had paid her rent on time for 6 years, who had submitted 3 written complaints about a technical failure that was not her fault, had been removed from her home in the middle of the night, and the system that was supposed to flag this for review had, somewhere along the line, simply not flagged it. The system had called her non-responsive, and then it had moved on to the next case. Marcus thought about his father's phrase, "Sentiment is a luxury only people without assets can afford." He had built an empire on that logic. He had made it efficient. He had scaled it. He had hired people and built software and drawn up contracts, and all of it, every layer of it, had been designed to remove sentiment from the process, to make the process clean and fast and predictable. He looked at the payment history table. 6 years of green check marks. And then, case resolved. He called Patricia at 6:15 a.m. She answered on the second ring, which told him she had been awake too. "Cancel everything today," he said. "Everything?" "Everything. And get me a car for 7. She asked where he was going. He told her Wicker Park. She did not ask why, because 9 years had taught her which questions to ask and which to simply write down. Marcus showered, dressed, skipped the coffee, and stood for a moment in the doorway of his home office. The box on the credenza sat where it had always sat. He had 30 minutes before the car arrived. He crossed the room and picked up the box. He set it on his desk. He pulled the tape off one end and opened the flap just far enough to see the top layer. A few folded papers, a small leather notebook, a photograph he recognized as his parents' wedding day. He closed the flap. He would look at it later. There was always later. Marcus Hale had built his entire life on the reliable existence of later. He put his jacket on and went downstairs to meet the car. Non-responsive. The building at 2214 Carlisle Street looked different in daylight. Not smaller, not larger, just more ordinary than a building that had generated 200,000 video views in 12 hours had any right to look. It was a 6-story brick structure built sometime in the 1970s with a row of buzzers by the front door and a lobby that was visible through the glass panel. Clean, functional, recently repainted in the pale gray that property management companies preferred because it photographed well and cost the least to maintain. A Vertex Property Solutions placard was mounted beside the door next to a handwritten notice taped at a slight angle that read, "All maintenance requests to be submitted via the online portal or call 1-800-VERTEX-1 between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., Monday through Friday." Marcus stood on the sidewalk in front of it for a long moment. He was wearing a gray sport coat and dark trousers, no tie, and he looked, he was aware, like someone who had arrived to assess a property rather than to understand one, which was, he supposed, exactly what he was doing, except that the word understand was new. He was not used to showing up to understand. He was used to showing up to decide. A woman emerged from the front door as he stood there. Mid-50s, wearing a postal service uniform, a canvas bag over one shoulder. She looked at him with the brief, measuring gaze that long-time city residents developed as a form of self-protection, the look that assessed threat level in approximately 3 seconds, then let it go. He was no threat. He was just another man in a sport coat who looked like he was about to ruin someone's day. She held the door for him without being asked. He thanked her and went in. The lobby smelled of floor cleaner and old radiator heat. A bulletin board near the mailboxes held a mix of community notices and flyers, a lost cat, a reminder about recycling protocol, a notice from the Chicago Department of Buildings about a routine inspection, and below all of those, slightly apart from the rest, a handwritten note that had been there long enough that the edges were beginning to curl. If the online portal is not working, please call the emergency number below. The emergency number was for Vertex. Below the number, in different handwriting, angrier, pressed harder into the paper, someone had written, "Doesn't work either." Marcus stood and read that note for a long time. Longer than he had spent reading most quarterly reports. He found the building manager's unit on the ground floor, as listed in the Vertex contract. Unit 101, a door that had a plastic nameplate reading Garrett Phelps, Regional Property Manager. He knocked. There was a pause, the sound of something being set down, and then the door opened. Garrett Phelps was 38 years old and looked like a man who had been woken up by his phone at 2 in the morning and had not been able to stop fielding calls since. He was wearing a Vertex polo shirt, the navy blue kind with the company logo on the chest, and he had the look of someone who had decided, somewhere around 4 a.m., that being calm and procedural was the only available survival strategy. He recognized Marcus. Of course he recognized Marcus. Marcus's photograph was in the Vertex Hale Capital contract packet that every regional manager received at onboarding. "Mr. Hale," he said, and his voice was careful in the way of a man who does not know yet whether he is about to be fired. Marcus said, "I'd like to talk about Unit 4C. Garrett said, "I understand." He stepped back and opened the door wider. The manager's unit was a one-bedroom that had been converted into a de facto field office, a folding table with 2 laptops, a printer, a stack of manila folders, and a coffee maker that appeared to have been running continuously since before Marcus was born. There was a cot in the corner with a sleeping bag on it, which told Marcus that Garrett Phelps lived, at least part-time, in this building, a detail that did not appear in any of the management reports Marcus had read at 5:30 a.m. Garrett did not apologize. This was the first thing Marcus noted. He also did not become defensive, did not reach immediately for legal language or PR posture. He sat down at the folding table, gestured for Marcus to take the other chair, and opened a laptop. "I know how this looks," Garrett said. "I need you to also know how it happened." Marcus said, "Go ahead." Garrett walked him through it with the precision of a man who had been rehearsing this explanation since the video went viral. The building's online payment portal, operated by a third-party vendor under Vertex's technology contract, had experienced a processing failure on August 29th. The vendor sent a maintenance notification to Vertex's system administrator email, not to building-level managers. The system administrator was on leave. The patch was applied 11 days later, on September 9th. During those 11 days, any payment submitted through the portal was technically processed at the vendor's end, but not transmitted to Vertex's ledger. It did not show as received. "So the system accepted her payment, but didn't record it," Marcus said. "Correct," Garrett said, which triggered an automatic late notice, which, under Vertex protocol, initiates a warning and payment demand sequence. He turned the laptop to face Marcus. "Here's the timeline. The tenant in 4C submitted a written complaint on September 4th, explaining the situation and requesting manual confirmation of her payment. The complaint was received by Vertex's tenant relations system." Marcus looked at the screen. He could see the complaint, time-stamped, with the auto-generated case number. He could see exactly where it went. Into a queue, and then into a sub-queue for cases where the tenant had been issued a late notice, and then, because the tenant had not followed up by phone within 5 business days, into the status of non-responsive. "She works nights," Marcus said. He was not asking. Garrett said, "I know that now. At the time, the system doesn't have a field for shift type. It doesn't have a field for why someone can't call between 9 and 5. It has a field for responded, and a field for non-responsive, and a field for case closed." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He thought about the phone number on the bulletin board in the lobby. The handwritten note. Doesn't work either. He thought about someone pressing a pen hard into paper. "Did you have discretion to halt the proceedings?" he asked. Garrett's answer was careful and honest in a way Marcus had not expected. "Yes and no. I have discretion up to 30 days. After 30 days, if I deviate from the eviction protocol for a flagged unit without written authorization from Vertex's regional compliance director, I am personally liable for any losses to the property owner during the deviation period." He paused. The flagged amount was 2 months of accrued late fees on top of a September payment that our system said wasn't made. Total, $3,847. He looked at Marcus. "I make $58,000 a year. I have a wife and 2 kids. I didn't feel like I had discretion." The room was very quiet. Marcus said, "Did you know the payment processing error was on our end?" Garrett said, "I suspected it after the second complaint. I sent an email to Vertex Regional noting the issue." He clicked to a different screen. "Here's the email, sent September 12th. The reply," he scrolled, came September 29th, 2 weeks after the eviction proceedings were initiated. The reply says, and I am reading this directly, "Thank you for flagging. System issue has been resolved. All pending cases should proceed per standard protocol." Marcus read the email. He read it twice. He had written the phrase standard protocol into 100 internal documents. He had championed systematic decision-making as a hedge against emotional inconsistency. He had told every management team he had ever hired that a good system should not require a hero to make it function correctly. He was looking at what that philosophy produced when the system made an error and no one was authorized to be a hero. He asked Garrett if there was any way to know how many other tenants had been affected by the payment processing failure. Garrett said Vertex had identified 9 units across the portfolio, of which 3 had been resolved with manual credits, 2 had resulted in evictions, and 4 were still in disputed status. 2 evictions, Marcus said. "Yes," Garrett said. He did not look away. Marcus stood up. He thanked Garrett for his time, which was the strangest thing Garrett Phelps had ever heard from a billionaire, but he nodded and said he was available if needed. As Marcus was heading for the door, Garrett said, "She came here, you know. Dee Marsh. She came to the office 3 times. The 3rd time she brought a printed bank statement showing the payment had left her account on September 1st. I wasn't here that day. I was at another property. My assistant took the statement and logged it. But by then, the proceedings were already in motion with the legal department, and my assistant didn't have authority to stop them." Marcus stopped with his hand on the doorframe. "She came 3 times, he said." Garrett said, "Yes." "She brought a bank statement," Marcus said. "Yes." "And you were not there?" "No," Garrett said. He said it quietly, like a man who had been saying it to himself all night and had not found a version of it that felt better. Marcus walked out into the lobby and stood for a moment near the bulletin board. He read the handwritten note again. "Doesn't work either." He thought about a woman in blue scrubs coming here 3 times, bringing paper evidence of her own correctness, and finding a door that opened to a person who could not help her, because the architecture of the system had been built without a door for this exact situation. He was still standing there when he heard footsteps behind him on the stairs and turned to see an older woman making her way down from the 2nd floor with careful deliberateness. 70s, he thought, or maybe a hard late 60s, with a red scarf around her neck and an expression that told him she had seen him standing in her lobby and decided, after approximately half a second of deliberation, that she had something to say. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at him steadily. "You're the owner?" she said. It was not a question. Marcus said that he was. She said, "My name is Ruth Okoro. I live in 4A. I want to tell you about my neighbor." He said, "Please." Ruth Okoro stood in her lobby with her arms folded across her chest. Not in hostility, Marcus thought, but in the way that a person holds themselves together when they are going to say something they have been holding for a while, and they need the structure of their own arms to keep it organized. "Delia Marsh moved in next door to me in 2018, Ruth said. She was 26 years old. She had a duffel bag and a crib and nothing else. She told me she was a nursing assistant working nights at Rush Medical Center. I told her if she ever needed someone to watch the baby during an emergency, I was retired and I was there. She took me up on that exactly twice in 6 years. She is not someone who asks for help easily." Ruth paused. She seemed to be deciding how much to say, and then deciding to say all of it. "In the spring of this year," she said, "Delia started working on her RN license. She was doing the coursework online between shifts because she could not afford to stop working. She would come home at 7 in the morning and sit at the kitchen table with her laptop and her textbooks while Cora was still sleeping. I know this because her window faces mine. I could see her light on. She was working every single day she was not at the hospital. She was not a person who was waiting for someone to take care of her." Marcus said, "Do you know where she is now?" "I don't know exactly," Ruth said. "She called me 2 days ago. She and Cora are staying with a friend, I think. She did not want to tell me too much because she did not want me to worry." She paused. "That is exactly the kind of person she is. She did not want me to worry." Marcus stood in the lobby. The bulletin board with the curling note was at his back. Garrett Phelps was somewhere behind the closed door of Unit 101. Somewhere in the city, a woman in blue-green scrubs was studying for a nursing license from someone else's couch with her daughter asleep nearby, and she had not wanted her 68-year-old neighbor to worry about her. "Is there anything else you can tell me?" Marcus asked. Ruth Okoro considered him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. She looked at him with an evenness that was neither hostile nor forgiving, just clear, the way things are clear when someone has decided to be precise. "I can tell you that she told me, when she first moved in, that she had once worked a night shift at Rush when a patient passed away with no family in the room, and that she stayed an extra 2 hours after her shift ended to sit with him and make sure that he did not go alone. She said she thought about that patient sometimes when the job got hard. She said it reminded her of what the job was actually for. Marcus went very still. Ruth said, "She mentioned it because I asked her why she chose nursing. She said the night she was thinking of was the night she decided to stay in the field." Marcus's voice, when it came, was quieter than he intended. "Did she say what hospital that was? Or when?" Ruth thought. "Rush, I think she said. A night shift a while back, maybe 4-5 years ago. She said the patient was older. He had no family with him. She stayed." Marcus said, "Thank you, Ruth." He said it without moving, without changing his expression. He said it to the floor more than to her. Ruth Okoro looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "I hope you do the right thing, Mr. Hale. Not because it's good for business. Because she deserves it." She turned and went back up the stairs. Marcus stood in the lobby for a long time after she was gone. On the credenza in his home office, under a flap of opened cardboard, there was a small leather notebook and a folded piece of paper and a photograph from a wedding day. He had closed the flap this morning and told himself he would look at it later. He thought about his father dying at Rush Medical Center on a cold morning in November. He thought about the nurse's notes in the palliative file. Patient resting, family notified, night nurse on call, which was the only reference to the person who had actually been there. He had been on a flight from London when his father died. He had landed 3 hours after. He had never known who the night nurse was. He walked out of the building into the October morning and stood on the sidewalk. The same sidewalk where, 18 hours ago, Delia Marsh had sat with her daughter asleep in her arms. The concrete was empty. The cardboard boxes were gone. Someone had cleaned up with the brisk efficiency of a city that never stops moving long enough to acknowledge what it has lost. Marcus stood on the sidewalk and made himself stand there. He did not call the car. He stood in the cold air on Carlisle Street for 11 minutes, which was 11 minutes longer than he had stood still outside and longer than he could remember. Then he took out his phone and called Patricia. "Get me a list of all current employees at Rush Medical Center," he said. "Nursing staff, night shift, anyone named Marsh. Check the personnel directory from 4 years ago. Cross-reference if you have to." Patricia said, "Can I ask why?" Marcus said, "I think I owe someone a very long overdue debt. What the system doesn't have a field for." Patricia called back at 2:47 p.m. She had cross-referenced the Rush Medical Center nursing staff directory, which was publicly available through the hospital's credentialing database, with the name Marsh. She had found one active record, Delia Marsh, RN candidate, currently listed under Rush's nursing student extern program in addition to her base role as a licensed practical nurse on the night shift of the 7th floor internal medicine ward. She had been at Rush for 7 years. Her supervisor's name and department contact were in the database. Marcus said, "Don't call ahead. I'll go in person." Patricia paused, then said, "Marcus, I want to make sure we're doing this correctly. Is there a legal dimension I need to?" Marcus said, "I need you to look in that credenza box in my office, the one marked DAD, personal. I need you to open it and look through the papers near the top. Small leather notebook, loose papers. There may be a note, handwritten." Patricia said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I'll call you back." He was in a car heading north when she called back 12 minutes later. Her voice, when she spoke, was careful in the way that people are careful with things that are fragile. "There's a small piece of paper," she said. "It looks like it was torn from a notepad. The handwriting it's different from his usual. Looser. Like it was written in a hurry or with difficulty." Marcus said, "What does it say?" She read it. "The night nurse who stayed. Find a way to repay her. Delia." That was all. 3 sentences, 14 words. Marcus sat in the back of the car and did not say anything for long enough that Patricia asked if he was still there. He was there. He was sitting in the back of a car on Lakeshore Drive, looking at the gray October water. And he was doing the arithmetic of the past 48 hours, and the answer kept coming out the same way. His father had died at Rush. A nurse named Delia had sat with him, had stayed when the shift ended, had stayed because she thought the work was about not letting people go alone. His father had written her name down. His father had died before he could do anything about it. And then the note had gone into a box, and the box had gone onto a credenza. And Marcus had walked past it every morning and not opened it, because he was a man who had been trained to believe that the things you cannot immediately act on are the things you put away for later. Later had not worked out. He asked Patricia to stay on the line and told the driver to head toward Rush Medical Center on West Harrison. They drove in silence for a while. Patricia, because she was Patricia, did not fill the silence with words. She waited. Marcus said, "How long was that box in my office before I opened it?" She said, 11 months. He said, "Why didn't you tell me to open it?" She said gently, "I did. Twice." He did not say anything to that. There was nothing adequate to say. The West Harrison entrance to Rush Medical Center was busy at 3 in the afternoon. The mid-shift change, the arriving visitors, the perpetual traffic of a major urban hospital that never fully slows. Marcus went through the main entrance, was directed to the nursing staff office on the 3rd floor by a volunteer who looked at his sport coat and either assumed he was a physician or a donor and treated him accordingly, and found himself outside a door marked Unit 4, Staffing, Nursing Coordinator, E. Walters. He knocked. A woman in her 50s opened the door with the expression of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something complicated, which, given that she was a nursing coordinator at a major urban hospital, was almost certainly accurate. Marcus introduced himself and said he was trying to reach Delia Marsh, not for a complaint, he added, noting the coordinator's expression shift, and not in a professional capacity. He said it was a personal matter, and that he would very much appreciate a few minutes. The coordinator, whose badge identified her as Elaine Walters, studied him with the particular scrutiny of someone whose job required her to quickly assess whether the person in front of her was trustworthy, a skill she had presumably spent years developing. "She is not on shift until tonight," Elaine said carefully, "and I am not able to give out personal contact information." "I understand," Marcus said. He gave her his card. He asked if she would be willing to pass along a message, that he would be in the hospital's main waiting area on the ground floor until 5 o'clock, and that he was not there about anything legal or procedural, and that he understood if she chose not to come. Elaine Walters looked at the card. She looked at Marcus. She had the expression of a woman who had watched a great many people with money use it to walk through doors that were supposed to be closed to them, and who had, over time, developed a finely calibrated sensitivity to the difference between entitlement and remorse. She said, "If I see her before her shift, I will pass along the message." He thanked her and went downstairs. He sat in the waiting area on the ground floor for 2 hours and 19 minutes. He sat in one of the standard waiting chairs, in a room full of families and anxious faces, and the particular quality of hospital waiting room air that manages to feel both sterile and heavy. He did not check his phone for the first hour. He did not review documents or return calls or do any of the 12 things that he would ordinarily do with 2 hours in a waiting room. He sat and watched people and let himself be in a room that was not optimized for efficiency. His father had died in this building. The thought was not new. He had known it every time he drove past Rush for the past year. But sitting in the waiting room at 3:15 on the Thursday afternoon gave it a different texture. This was where people came when things had gone wrong enough that they needed the biggest kind of help available. This was where the margins of a person's life became visible. The man across from him was holding his wife's hand so tightly that the knuckles were white. The woman 2 rows over was nursing a toddler with the glazed focus of someone running on very little sleep. A teenage boy near the window was eating chips from a vending machine bag with the methodical intensity of someone who had not eaten in a while and was not sure when he would eat again. Marcus sat in his excellent sport coat in a plastic chair and thought about the phrase his father had given him at 16. Sentiment is a luxury. He thought about the man across the room with the white knuckles. He thought about the fact that from the outside, from a boardroom, from a 43rd floor penthouse, this room looked like a liability. From inside it looked like the only real thing. She arrived at 4:53 p.m. He saw her before she saw him, because he had been looking toward the entrance for a while, and because he recognized her immediately. Not from the video, not from the scrubs, but from the way she held herself. Same posture, back straight, head up. She was wearing street clothes, jeans, a gray sweater, a canvas bag on one shoulder, and she moved through the waiting room with the particular gait of a person who has navigated crowded hospital waiting rooms their entire working life. Purposeful, aware of other people in her path, not looking for anyone who might want something from her. She looked for him and found him with no difficulty, because there were very few men in expensive sport coats sitting alone in plastic chairs at 4:53 p.m. She stopped a few feet away. She did not extend her hand. She did not smile. "Mr. Hale," she said. He stood. He said, "Miss Marsh, thank you for coming." She said, "I have 40 minutes before I have to be upstairs, and I don't have anything to say to you." He said, "I know. I have something to say to you, if that's all right." A long pause. She glanced at the chairs, then at the entrance, as if confirming she knew where the exit was. Then she sat down, not in the chair closest to him, but in the one beside it, at a slight angle, the configuration of someone who was present, but had not agreed to anything yet. He sat down. He did not immediately speak, which was, for Marcus Hale, unprecedented. He had built an entire professional identity around being the first person to speak in any room. He said, "I want to tell you why I came here myself, without lawyers and without a prepared statement." He stopped. "That's not right." He started again. "I want to start with my father. His name was William Hale. He died here, at Rush, about a year ago. He was alone when he died. I was on a plane. He didn't have family nearby, and the timing was—" He stopped. She was watching him. Her expression was not hostile. It was not warm. It was the expression of someone who had learned, through a combination of professional necessity and personal history, to wait and see. He said, "A nurse stayed with him. After her shift, she stayed with him so he wouldn't be alone. He wrote her name down before he died. He wrote a note that said to find her and repay her. He said her name was Delia." The room was loud in the way that hospital waiting rooms are always loud, the ambient noise of a building that processes human crises at scale. But between the two of them, in those plastic chairs, there was a specific stillness. Delia Marsh looked at him. Her expression had changed, not broken open, not collapsed, just shifted. Like something underneath the surface had moved. She said, "The patient in 412, November last year." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He asked me when I checked on him around midnight if I had anywhere to be. I told him I had a daughter at home. He said I should go. I said she was asleep and my neighbor was there and I was fine. He smiled at me. He said," she paused. He said, "Thank you for being a person who stays." Marcus Hale, who had not cried at his father's funeral because the funeral had been scheduled around his travel calendar and he had been in operational mode from the moment he landed, sat in a plastic waiting room chair in Rush Medical Center at 4:57 p.m. and felt something in his chest do something he could not name. He said, "He was right about you." Delia said, "I didn't know his name. I looked at the chart the next morning when I came back for my next shift, but the chart had been closed and transferred to the family liaison. I thought about him, though. You do that sometimes, with patience." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad he wasn't alone." Marcus said, "I have to tell you, and this is the part I need you to hear, because I am not here to manage this. I am here to say it. Everything that happened at Carlisle Street was my system, not the specific decision, not Garrett Phelps, who had less room to move than you know, but the architecture of it. The contract I signed with Vertex, the management structure I approved, the portal that didn't have a way for a night shift worker to file a complaint when the office was closed. All of it traces back to decisions I made, or failed to make, or failed to examine. And the fact that I didn't know about it until it went viral on the internet is not an excuse. It is the same problem, one layer up." Delia listened to all of this. When he finished, she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That's a very thorough acknowledgement." He said, "I mean it." She looked at him directly. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I need you to understand something. I have a daughter. She is 5 years old. We are currently sleeping on an air mattress in my friend Keisha's living room. Cora thinks it is an adventure. She has not asked me why we don't go home, because she trusts me to manage it. When she stops trusting me to manage it, when she gets old enough to understand what happened, I don't know what I'm going to tell her." She paused. "So yes, I hear what you're saying, and I appreciate that you came here and said it yourself, but appreciation isn't the same as trust. And I don't know you, and the last system that was supposed to protect me very specifically did not." He said, "That's fair." She said, "What do you intend to do?" He said, "I intend to fix it. Not just for you. I mean, not just writing you a check and calling it square. I mean the structure that made this possible. The Vertex contract, the payment systems, the escalation protocol. The fact that there is no pathway for a tenant who cannot reach anyone between 9 and 5 on a weekday. I want to fix the structure. But I also want to fix your specific situation first. Tonight. Or as soon as you'll let me." She looked at him. She said, "I'm not ready to let you." He said, "Okay." She stood up. She picked up her canvas bag. She said, "I need to go upstairs." He nodded. She took 2 steps toward the elevator and then stopped and turned back, not all the way, just enough to say something to the space between them. She said, "He was a kind man, your father." I could tell that in about 3 minutes. She turned back to the elevator and went upstairs. Marcus sat in the plastic chair for a while longer. The man with the white knuckles across the room was now talking quietly to a doctor. The woman who had been nursing her toddler was asleep in her chair, the child asleep against her, in almost exactly the same posture as the girl in the video. In the same way, against the same shoulder, with the same total, unguarded trust. Marcus Hale sat in the waiting room of Rush Medical Center and did not move for 15 minutes. And the thing he was doing in those 15 minutes was something he had not done in a long time. Maybe not since he was a boy, standing outside that real estate office in Evanston, watching his father sign the first loan. He was thinking about what he actually owed, and to whom, and whether the accounting system he had built his life around had been tracking the right currency. He drove back to his building slowly. He did not ask the driver to hurry, which was unusual. Marcus's default with drivers was brisk efficiency, the 10-minute window that could be used productively. He looked out the window at the city moving past. Chicago in October had a particular quality of light, a low amber slant that made everything look like it was being seen through old glass. The neighborhoods west of the Loop came in layers, the glass and steel corridor, Then the transitional blocks where coffee shops sat next to payday loan signs. Then the residential streets where everything was older and more lived in and more real in ways that the 43rd floor did not always permit him to see. He thought about Ruth Okoro standing at the bottom of the stairs with her arms folded. She stayed an extra 2 hours after her shift ended. He thought about Delia at 4 in the morning after a 12-hour shift, sitting in a dead man's room because she had decided, not because anyone asked her to, not because it was in her job description, not because it served any measurable efficiency metric, that the right thing was not to leave a person alone. His father had written her name down. 3 words and a name, pressed into paper with hands that were failing, by a man who had spent 60 years believing that sentiment was a luxury and who had spent, apparently, at least one of his last hours in the company of someone who did not believe that at all, and who had made him feel, Marcus suspected, the particular kind of peace that comes from being in the presence of genuine kindness. Thank you for being a person who stays. Marcus looked out at the amber city light. He thought about the phrase his father had said to him at 16, outside the office building, pulling him away from the man on the sidewalk. Sentiment is a luxury only people without assets can afford. He had believed it. He had believed it so completely and for so long that it had stopped feeling like a belief and started feeling like a fact about the world. Like gravity, like compound interest. A rule that operated whether you thought about it or not. But his father had written the nurse's name down. His father, at the end, with his hands failing and his children on airplanes, had known something about what mattered. He had written, "Find a way to repay her." Not as a transaction, not as a debt to be discharged. As a way of saying, this person represented something. Make sure it is honored. Marcus had put the note in a box and walked past the box for 11 months. He called Patricia from the car. "I need to do 2 things simultaneously," he said. "First, I need Vertex to halt any pending eviction proceedings across the entire Hale Capital portfolio until we have completed a full audit of all cases flagged in the last 18 months. I need this effective immediately, tonight, with written confirmation." Patricia said, "That will require Vertex's legal sign-off. They're going to push back." Marcus said, "Then get me Vertex's general counsel on the phone tonight. Tell them the alternative is that I exercise the audit clause in our master contract, which I am going to do regardless. But they can cooperate or they can have it done to them. Second, and separately, keep this separate. I need a tenant stabilization fund set up within the Hale Capital Foundation. Emergency use, no interest, designed for situations involving payment processing errors, administrative failures, or disputes under active review. Design it so that any tenant who has been with us for more than 2 years can access emergency funds while a dispute is pending, without having to prove anything other than tenancy and a dispute on file. I want draft framework by morning." Patricia was quiet for a moment, taking notes. He said, "One more thing. Get me the original Vertex management contract. I want to read every line of the escalation clause myself, tonight." She said, "It's 87 pages. He said, "I know. That's why I should have read it more carefully the first time." He hung up. He sat back in the seat and looked at his hands in his lap, the hands of a man who had built something large and efficient and profitable, and who had not asked, with sufficient seriousness, whether large and efficient and profitable was the whole of what he was building. When he got back to his building, he took the elevator to 43. He walked through the apartment to the home office. He picked up the cardboard box from the credenza and carried it to the center of the desk under the lamp. He opened it properly this time. He spent the next 2 hours going through everything his father had left. The photograph, the leather notebook, which turned out to be a journal of observations about properties his father had visited in the 1980s, property by property, with small notes about the tenants he had met, details about their jobs and families written in his father's careful architectural hand. Not for any purpose Marcus could immediately identify, just because his father had looked at the people and written them down. He found the small piece of notepaper near the bottom of the stack. It was there, exactly as Patricia had described, the night nurse who stayed. Find a way to repay her, Delia. He held it in his hands. He thought about the man his father had been. A man who told a 16-year-old boy that sentiment was a luxury, and who then, at the very end of his life, in a hospital room in the middle of the night, had been saved from dying alone by someone who disagreed. He set the note down on the center of his desk. He placed a glass paperweight over it to keep it flat. Then he picked up the 87-page Vertex contract and began to read. The name on the paper. The audit of the Vertex system took 11 days. Marcus ran it himself. Not personally, line by line, but with the same focused attention he had given to the original Bloomberg terminal at 5:30 a.m., calling in the same team he would have called to perform due diligence on a $2 billion acquisition. Because that was, he had decided, the correct calibration. The problem was at least that serious. The problem was, in fact, more serious. Across the Hale Capital residential portfolio, 38,000 units in 11 cities, the audit identified 847 cases in the past 3 years that bore the designation non-responsive. Of those, 312 had resulted in completed evictions. Of those 312, the audit team, working with a tenant advocacy attorney Marcus had retained specifically for this analysis, estimated that between 90 and 140 involved circumstances substantially similar to Delia Marsh's, meaning technical errors, communication gaps attributable to system failure rather than tenant fault, or escalation timelines that had moved faster than any human pathway for appeal. Marcus read this finding at 11 p.m. on a Thursday, alone in his office, with the Vertex contract open on one monitor and the audit spreadsheet on the other. He sat with it for a long time. Then he called Patricia, who was still at her desk, because Patricia was always at her desk when things were happening, and he said, "Pull all 312 files." She said, "That's going to take time." He said, "However long it takes." He went to see Delia Marsh a second time before the audit was complete. He did not call ahead. He went to Rush on a Tuesday evening and sat in the lobby until Elaine Walters came down on her break and told him that Delia had asked her to say that she was not available, which was a more courteous version of no than he deserved. He thanked Elaine and left. He went back to Carlisle Street the following week to see Ruth Okoro, who fed him terrible coffee and showed him a photograph of Cora that Delia had texted her, and who told him that Delia was doing fine, that Cora was adjusting, that Delia was studying for her RN boards and still working nights, and that she, Ruth, did not think Marcus had done enough yet. He said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do about it?" He said, "I'm going to change the architecture of how this gets handled. Not just a policy memo, the actual contract, the actual system. I've stopped the Vertex proceedings across the whole portfolio. I'm negotiating new escalation standards that require a human review for any tenant over 2 years before proceedings move forward. I'm building a fund that provides no-interest emergency assistance while disputes are pending. I'm hiring 2 tenant liaisons in each city, with extended hours and a direct escalation line that Vertex cannot override." Ruth listened to all of this. She said, "That's a lot of words." He said, "Yes." She said, "Delia is going to need to see actions." He said, "I know. I have time." Ruth Okoro refilled his cup with coffee that tasted strongly of something Marcus could not identify but suspected was partially scorched, and she said, "I'll tell her you came back." That was in the second week. The week after that, Marcus received a call from Vertex's general counsel, informing him that Vertex intended to challenge the unilateral audit as a violation of their operational independence clause. Marcus's legal team had been expecting this and had prepared accordingly. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, and ended with Vertex agreeing to cooperate with the audit in exchange for a revised contract structure that gave them improved economics on renewals. Marcus gave them the economics. He considered it a reasonable trade for what he was getting, which was a working system with a human escalation pathway built into its foundation. The audit findings were delivered in full on a Friday morning. Marcus read the executive summary in his office with the door closed and the note from his father under the glass paperweight on the corner of his desk. And then he went to find Delia Marsh. Not at the hospital this time. He had asked Patricia, carefully, to reach out through Elaine Walters with a specific message. Not a request for a meeting, but an acknowledgement that the Hale Tenant Stabilization Fund was operational as of that morning, that Delia was eligible for assistance under the fund's terms, which covered all tenants displaced by verifiable administrative errors, and that there was a document ready for her to review if she chose to, at a time of her choosing, with an attorney present if she wanted one. 3 days later, Delia's attorney, a housing rights lawyer from the Metropolitan Tenants Organization whom Marcus had not met before but had heard of, called Marcus's assistant and scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday. The meeting was in a conference room at the Metropolitan Tenants Organization offices on the 17th floor of a building in the South Loop. It was deliberately on their territory, which Marcus had insisted upon when his own team suggested holding it at Hale Capital's offices. He brought his general counsel and Patricia. Delia brought her attorney and, which Marcus had not anticipated, Keisha Drummond, the friend whose air mattress she had been sleeping on, who sat beside Delia and did not say anything but whose presence was clearly load-bearing in a way Marcus understood without needing it explained. Delia's attorney laid out her position in 15 minutes. She wanted full restoration of the tenancy or equivalent alternative housing of comparable quality and cost within the same neighborhood. She wanted a written acknowledgement from Hale Capital that the eviction had been executed in error and that no adverse record would exist. She wanted confirmation that the Hale Tenant Stabilization Fund was a permanent structural commitment and not a one-time gesture. And she wanted a seat on the fund's advisory board, a tenant voice in how the criteria were designed and applied. Marcus's general counsel glanced at him. Marcus said, "Yes, to all four." The attorney said, "All four." Marcus said, "Yes." The attorney made a note. She said she would need it in writing. Marcus said his team would have a draft to them within 48 hours. He looked at Delia across the table, who was looking at the document in front of her with the expression of someone who was listening for the part where something goes wrong. He said, "I want to say one more thing, not in the document, just here, for the record of this room." Delia looked up. He said, "Your attorney has done excellent work, and I want to honor the formal process. But I also want to say, directly and without ambiguity, that what happened to you was wrong. Not in a policy sense, in a human sense. You did everything correctly. You paid on time for 6 years. You reported a system failure that was not your fault. You came to this building 3 times with documentation. The system labeled you non-responsive and proceeded. And every mechanism that should have caught that failed in sequence, including the mechanism at the top, which was me." He paused. "I am sorry. I know that's not sufficient, but it's true." The room was quiet. Keisha Drummond, who had not said a word the entire meeting, leaned slightly toward Delia and said something quiet, just to her, that Marcus could not hear. Delia did not respond visually to it, but something in her posture shifted, very slightly, the way things shift when someone you trust says something that confirms what you are trying to decide. Delia said, "My daughter asked me what happened to our apartment. I told her there had been a mistake and that we were going to fix it. She said, 'Okay, Mama.' She said, 'Does the person who made the mistake know about it?' I said, 'Yes.' She said, 'Did they say sorry?' I told her that someone was working on it." Marcus said nothing. Delia said, "She said, and I need you to hear this because she is 5 years old and she said it without any awareness that it was extraordinary. She said, 'Okay, that's good. Because sorry is the first part. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Marcus said, "What's the second part?" Delia said, "I think you know." Let's step outside the story for a moment. What happened to Delia Marsh is fiction. Marcus Hale and Hale Capital Residential are not real, but the system that produced her situation, that part is real, and it is vast. In the United States, eviction filings number in the millions every year. Research from Princeton's Eviction Lab, which has been tracking this for years, estimates that eviction is disproportionately concentrated among renters in low-income households, and that a significant portion of filed cases involve disputes that tenants contest. But courts, in most jurisdictions, process eviction cases in under 3 minutes per case. 3 minutes. Many tenants do not appear at all, not because they do not care, but because taking a morning off work means losing pay they cannot afford to lose. A recurring theme in housing justice research is the role of administrative error, payment processing failures, lost documentation, miscommunication between management layers, in producing evictions that were technically avoidable. The number is difficult to quantify precisely because management systems are private and data is fragmented. What we can say is that the infrastructure of property management in large private residential portfolios is increasingly automated, and automation is efficient until it is wrong. And when it is wrong, the error often travels faster than the human capacity to catch it. Night shift workers, nurses, warehouse workers, home health aides, hotel staff are structurally disadvantaged in a dispute process built around business hours. If you cannot call between 9 and 5, you are, in many systems, effectively voiceless. The system does not have a field for shift type. It has a field for responded and a field for non-responsive, and nothing in between. This does not require a villain. It requires a system that was built for speed and scale and never re-examined for what happens at the edges. Marcus Hale committed, in that conference room, to do something that did not require villainy to be necessary. He committed to re-examine the edges. Whether that would be enough, that was still to be determined. Because Delia Marsh had looked at him across the table and said, "Sorry," is the first part. And Marcus had said he knew what the second part was. But knowing is not the same as doing. And doing, it was turning out, was harder and slower and more resistant to optimization than any business process Marcus Hale had ever managed. The Vertex negotiation broke down twice before it held. The first breakdown was over the audit scope. Vertex's operational team, not their general counsel who had already agreed, but their executive leadership, sent a letter through a separate legal channel arguing that the audit as currently structured violated a confidentiality provision in the master contract that protected tenant data from disclosure to property owners. This was, Marcus's team noted, a creative reading of a provision that had been designed to protect tenants from having their information sold, being now deployed to protect Vertex from scrutiny. Marcus sent a one-line response. "We will be proceeding with the audit. We invite you to join us in conducting it correctly rather than obstructing it." There was no reply. The audit continued. The second breakdown was over the emergency tenant fund. Vertex argued that a fund providing financial assistance to tenants in active disputes created a direct conflict of interest with their operational mandate, because a tenant who knew they could access emergency funds was a tenant who was more likely to file a dispute and delay proceedings, which increased Vertex's per-case management costs. This was, Marcus noted privately, an accurate description of exactly what the fund was designed to do. He said as much to Vertex's team in the follow-up call. He said, "You're correct that tenants with access to emergency resources are more likely to contest evictions. That is the point. The question you are actually asking is whether we should remove the ability of tenants to defend themselves in order to reduce your operational costs. And the answer to that question is no." Vertex's representative on the call said, "Mr. Hale, with respect, that is not a sustainable position from a portfolio management perspective." Marcus said, "Then we will need to renegotiate the portfolio management contract." There was a pause on the line. Then Vertex's representative said he would need to take that back to executive leadership. Marcus said, "Take all the time you need. The audit continues in the meantime." The third and final stage of the negotiation, the one that actually held, came when Marcus agreed to underwrite a portion of Vertex's increased per-case management costs for disputes resolved in tenants' favor, where the original eviction had been initiated based on system error. He framed this as a cost-sharing mechanism, which allowed Vertex to describe it internally as a contractual accommodation rather than a concession. It cost Marcus's company approximately $1.4 million a year in additional management fees, against a portfolio generating roughly $340 million in annual revenue. When his CFO saw the numbers, she came to his office and stood in front of his desk with the expression of a woman who had not been asked her opinion, but was going to give it. She said, "Marcus, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. We are paying more to the management company in order to create a system that makes it easier for tenants to dispute evictions." He said, "Yes." She said, "Because?" He said, "Because we spent 11 years building a system optimized for eviction efficiency, and the result was that a nurse who paid her rent on time for 6 years lost her home because our portal was broken, and our escalation protocol assumed everyone is available between 9 and 5. He looked at her. The reputational cost of the viral video, the legal exposure, the coverage, the 3 investigative pieces that ran in the Tribune and the Sun-Times, has already cost us more than $1.4 million. The cost of not fixing it will be higher." His CFO was quiet for a moment. She said, "Is this a business argument or a moral argument?" He said, "I'm not sure that's a useful distinction anymore." She looked at him. She said, "Who are you, and what have you done with Marcus Hale?" He said, "I'm working on that question myself." She left. He returned to the 87 pages. The night after the Vertex negotiations concluded, Marcus Hale did something he had not done since he was in his early 20s, when he was new to the business and still went to see properties on weekends just to understand what he was building. He drove out to Carlisle Street alone after midnight and parked down the block and sat in the car. The building was quiet. The lights in most units were off. A light was on in 4A, Ruth's unit, a warm yellow square on the second floor. A light was on in one of the first 4 units, the blue-white flicker of a television. The front entrance looked the same as it always had. The Hale Capital logo was still there, the stylized H in navy blue. Marcus sat in the car for a while and looked at it. Then he got out and walked to the entrance and stood on the sidewalk. The same sidewalk. The concrete was cold under the street light. An empty plastic bag was moving slowly in the wind near the curb. He stood where she had sat. He made himself stand there and think about what it would mean to be here at 2 in the morning with a child asleep in your arms, and with everything you owned in boxes on the concrete, and with 6 years of doing everything right behind you, and nothing but uncertainty in front of you. He stood there for a while, long enough to be cold, long enough for a car to pass and slow and then move on, the driver presumably deciding he was not interesting enough to stop for. Then he went back to his car. He sat for a moment longer. He was not going to be able to fix what had already happened. That was the thing he was still learning to sit with, and it was harder than fixing the system because the system could be rewritten and the night on the sidewalk could not. The fund was operational. The audit was complete. The Vertex contract had been renegotiated. 147 additional cases had been identified and flagged for individual review. His team was working through them one by one. He started the car and drove home through the amber October streets. The note was still on his desk, still under the paperweight. The night nurse who stayed. Find a way to repay her. Delia. He had found her. The repayment was going to take longer than a note. He had accepted this. He thought his father would have understood that the kind of repayment worth making was not a transaction, but a practice, something you came back to repeatedly over time, in the way that a person who stays is different from a person who visits once and leaves. He was learning, at 54, what staying actually looked like when it was not made of money. What it actually costs. Scene A. The board meeting. The Hale Capital Residential Board of Directors convened for an emergency session 12 days after the Carlisle Street story went national. There were 9 board members. 6 of them were on the line by video, 2 were in the room, and 1, Donald Ferry, the lead independent director and a man who had been on the board since Marcus's father's time, was present in person. Seated at Marcus's right, which was his traditional seat and which had, over 20 years, come to feel like a permanent feature of the room's architecture. Marcus had distributed the preliminary findings before the meeting. He had not softened them. The first voice to emerge after the opening formalities belonged to a board member named Craig Whitmore, who ran a private equity operation in Dallas and who had joined the board 4 years ago on the strength of his understanding of residential portfolio economics. Craig was not a malicious man. He was a man who thought in quarters. "Marcus," Craig said, his voice even through the video feed, "I want to make sure we're approaching this correctly. We have a PR incident. We have a contractual dispute with Vertex, and we have what you are describing as a systemic audit with significant remediation costs. My concern, and I think I speak for at least some of the room, is that we are responding to a single incident with structural changes whose cost-benefit profile has not been fully modeled." Marcus said, "The cost-benefit profile has been modeled. It's in the supplemental on page 12. Craig said, "The model assumes that the reputational costs of the current situation are ongoing and compounding. I'd push back on that assumption. News cycles move on." Marcus said, "Craig, in the past 3 weeks, we have received 14 requests for comment from journalists at 5 different outlets, 2 letters from state-level housing advocacy organizations citing our portfolio as a case study, and 1 preliminary inquiry from the Illinois Attorney General's office about our eviction practices. The news cycle is not moving on. We are now a named example." A silence on the line. Then Rena Khatri, who ran her own fund and who had, over the years, been the board member most willing to take the long view, said, "Marcus, can you walk us through the cost model again? The $1.4 million annually against what revenue figure?" He walked them through it. He walked them through it clearly and without editorializing, which was the version of this argument that could be made in a boardroom. And he made it well because it was true. The math supported the change. That was the thing about doing the right thing in a system built on economics. Sometimes the numbers lined up, not because the universe was just, but because bad publicity and legal exposure and regulatory scrutiny all have quantifiable costs that, when properly summed, exceed the cost of prevention. Donald Ferry, who had not spoken yet, said, "I'd like to hear about the tenant fund." Marcus described the fund, the structure, the eligibility criteria, the governance. He described the advisory board with a tenant seat. He described Delia Marsh's position on that board. Donald said, "You're giving a seat to the woman who was evicted." Marcus said, "I'm giving a seat to a tenant who experienced the failure firsthand and who is more qualified than anyone in this room to understand where the system breaks." Yes. Donald was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Marcus had not expected from the man who had sat on his board since his father's time. "Good." He said it simply. "Good. We should have had a structure like this years ago." Craig Whitmore cleared his throat. He said, "I want this on record. I think we're making a significant structural change based on inadequate time for deliberation." Marcus said, "Noted. The record will also reflect that we are making this change after a woman who paid her rent for 6 years without fault lost her home due to a system error, and that we are making it because it is both financially defensible and the right thing to do." and that the time for deliberation was actually the previous 11 years during which we did not examine these protocols closely enough. Craig said nothing after that. The vote to approve the structural changes, the revised Vertex contract terms, the Hale Tenant Stabilization Fund, the expanded tenant liaison network, passed 7-2. Craig was one of the 2 no votes. Donald Ferry was the one who called for the vote to be recorded, which was unusual, and which Marcus understood as his quiet way of making sure the record showed who was on which side of this. After the board call ended, Donald stayed in the conference room while the others filtered out. He poured himself a glass of water from the credenza. He said, without turning around, "Your father would have argued both sides of this, you know. He was a complicated man." Marcus said, "I know." Donald said, "But he would have come around." Marcus said, "I think he came around before I did." Donald Fair turned and looked at him. He said, "I didn't know William well in his last years. Did something shift with him?" Marcus said, "There was a nurse at the hospital. She stayed with him so he wouldn't be alone. He wrote her name down. He asked me to find a way to repay her." Donald Fair was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "And?" Marcus said, "She's on the advisory board." Donald set down his glass. He said, "Then this is a proper story." Scene B. The second refusal. Marcus went to Keisha Drummond's apartment building in Logan Square on a Saturday morning in November, 3 weeks after the board meeting. He had a letter from his legal team and a document from the Hale Capital Foundation. He rang the buzzer. Keisha's voice came through the intercom. "Who is it?" He gave his name. A long pause. Keisha said, "She said she doesn't want to see you." He said, "I understand. I brought papers for her to review if she's willing to take them. She doesn't have to open the door." Another pause. Then the door buzzed open. He went up to the 3rd floor and stood in the hallway outside apartment 3D. The door did not open. He slid the envelope under the door. He said to the closed door, "The first document is the formal acknowledgement that the eviction was processed in error. No adverse record exists. The second is the advisory board appointment. The third is the housing stabilization offer. It's a 2-year lease for a unit in Wicker Park, Carlisle Street property, Unit 4C, at the same rent, effective immediately. You don't have to decide now. You don't have to decide at all. It is available when and if you want it." A silence behind the door. He said, "I'm not going to ask you to trust me. I know that trust is not built in a conference room and not built with documents. I'm just trying to make the right thing available to you and to leave it there and to come back and try again if you'll let me." No response. He said, "My father's name was William Hale. He was 67 years old. He was not an easy man. He taught me that caring about people was a weakness. And then he met you and wrote your name down and asked me to find you. I think he was trying to tell me something. I think he was trying to tell me something about the kind of person worth being. I'm sorry it took me this long to read the note." He stood in the hallway for a moment longer. He could hear, very faintly from behind the door, the sound of a child's television program, something cartoon bright and rhythmic, full of cheerful music. Then he walked back down the stairs and out into the November street. 3 days later, Delia's attorney called his assistant to say that Delia was accepting the housing stabilization offer. She was not yet prepared to accept the advisory board appointment. She would keep the formal acknowledgement. "Progress," Marcus's attorney said. Marcus said, "Yes." He said it like a man who was learning to value small increments. Scene C. What Cora asked. The lease signing happened on a Thursday morning in December in the lobby of the Carlisle Street building. Marcus was there because Delia had asked, through her attorney, carefully, in writing, if he would be present. He did not know why she had asked. He did not ask why. He went. Ruth Okoro was there. She had come downstairs with a plate of something wrapped in foil and a look of contained satisfaction that suggested she had been waiting for this morning for a while. Keisha Drummond was there. Elaine Walters from Rush had sent a card that Ruth had taped to the mailbox. Delia arrived at 9:30 with Cora. Cora was 5 years old and wearing a yellow coat and carrying a stuffed rabbit that had, from the look of it, been through a great deal. She looked around the lobby with the alert interest of a child who finds new places interesting rather than threatening, which said something about how Delia had managed the past 2 months that no document could have captured. The signing itself took 12 minutes. Delia sat at the folding table Garrett Phelps had set up in the lobby. Garrett was there too, quieter than usual, standing near the back, with an expression Marcus recognized as the specific form of relief that comes when you have been carrying guilt and something is beginning to lift. And she signed the lease with the particular focused attention of someone who was reading every page, because she was a person who had learned, at significant cost, to read every page. When it was done, she straightened the papers and put them in her canvas bag and sat for a moment. Then Cora looked up at Marcus, who had been standing somewhat awkwardly near the bulletin board. The bulletin board that still had the handwritten note, though someone had taken down the original and replaced it with a properly typeset card with the emergency contact information in larger font. Cora said, "Are you the man who knows my grandpa's name?" The lobby went very quiet. Marcus looked at her. He said, "What did your mama tell you about him?" Cora thought about this with the specific gravity of a 5-year-old forming a sentence carefully. She said there was a man who was sad and by himself, and she stayed with him so he wasn't by himself anymore. She said that was a long time ago. She said he was nice." She looked at Marcus. "Are you his son?" Marcus said, "Yes." Cora considered this. She said, "He knew my mama was nice." She said it with total confidence, the confidence of a child who has not yet learned that the people she loves might need defending, because it has not yet occurred to her that they would be anything other than obviously worth knowing. Marcus said, "He did. He knew right away." Cora nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to show her stuffed rabbit to Ruth Okoro, who received it with the appropriate seriousness. Delia was looking at Marcus. Her expression was, not forgiveness, not yet, and maybe not ever entirely, because some things do not arrive whole, but something adjacent to it. Something that was at least in the same neighborhood. The beginning of the possibility of something. She said, "I named her after my grandmother, Cora. She was a practical woman. She used to say, she said that people show you who they are by what they come back to." Marcus said, "What do you mean?" Delia said, "She meant that it's not what you say in the big moment. It's what you keep showing up for after." She paused. "You've come back a few times now," he said. "I intend to keep coming back." She said, "I know. That's why I asked you to be here today." She picked up her canvas bag and her daughter's coat, which had been folded on the chair. She said, "I'm working on the RN boards in January. I need to study." She looked at him levelly. "The advisory board." "I'll think about it," he said. "Take your time." She said, "I usually do." She called Cora, who said goodbye to Ruth Okoro's foil package of food with genuine enthusiasm, and took her mother's hand, and they went upstairs together to Unit 4C, which was theirs. Scene D, 18 months later. The Hale Tenant Stabilization Fund completed its first full operational year in June, 18 months after it had been announced and approximately 8 months after it had actually, functionally, worked the way it was supposed to. The numbers in the annual report, which Marcus reviewed with the fund's director and its advisory board, were these: 412 emergency assistance cases opened, 389 resolved without eviction. Of the 23 that had proceeded to eviction, 17 were cases where the tenant had voluntarily vacated during the review period. 6 had been adjudicated through the courts. The fund had disbursed a total of $1.8 million in no-interest emergency loans, of which 81% had been partially or fully repaid on voluntary repayment schedules. Vertex had processed 0 non-responsive case closures in the past 9 months, because the new escalation protocol required a human case reviewer to confirm attempted tenant contact before the status could be applied. These were good numbers. Marcus read them with the satisfaction of a person who had learned, slowly, to be satisfied by numbers that measured human outcomes alongside financial ones. The advisory board met quarterly. Delia Marsh was on it. She had joined in April, 4 months after the lease signing, without fanfare and without a press release, because she had asked for neither. She came to the meetings prepared, with questions, with examples, with the particular precision of a person who has studied a subject and does not intend to waste the time of the room. In the 3rd meeting, she had proposed a standardized audit checklist for cases involving tenants with irregular work hours, which the board had adopted unanimously, and which Marcus had then recommended as a model to 2 other major residential landlords he knew, one of whom had implemented it by the end of the fiscal year. He did not take credit for the checklist. It was hers. The Vertex contract renewal was signed in the spring, with the new terms fully incorporated. Craig Whitmore had resigned from the board in February, citing a conflict with his fund's investment mandate. Donald Ferre had been elected board chair. Garrett Phelps was still managing the Carlisle Street property under a revised performance framework that included tenant satisfaction scores alongside operational metrics. On a Thursday in June, Marcus drove to Wicker Park on his way home from a meeting in the Loop. He had not planned to stop on Carlisle Street. He was passing by, which was something he did occasionally. Not for sentimental reasons, he told himself, though he had become less certain about the distinction between sentiment and evidence. He parked and walked to the building entrance. The placard next to the door now had 2 entries, the Vertex contact information, and below it, a Hale tenant services line with hours that ran from 7 in the morning to 9 at night, 7 days a week. The tenant services line had handled 608 calls in the past quarter. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The October light had that particular low, amber quality again. He had noticed he paid attention to October light now, which he had not done before. A group of kids were visible on the sidewalk half a block down, 3 of them on bikes, one of them sitting on a stoop eating a popsicle and watching the bikers with philosophical contentment. A window opened on the 2nd floor. Ruth Okoro leaned out. She saw him and gave him a look that was approximately 12% warmer than her look at their first meeting, which he had decided was significant progress. She said, "You're going to get a parking ticket." He said, "Probably." She said, "She's upstairs." He said, "I know, I'm not stopping, I'm just passing by." Ruth looked at him for a moment. She said, "She passed her boards, you know." He said, "I know." Ruth said, "She celebrated by ordering pizza and falling asleep on the couch at 9 p.m. He said, "That sounds right." Ruth nodded. She said, in a tone that was entirely matter-of-fact and entirely not, "You did okay, Marcus." She closed the window. He stood on the sidewalk for another minute, his hands in his pockets in the amber October light. Somewhere upstairs, in Unit 4C, a newly licensed registered nurse was probably studying something else, because the kind of person who stays is always finding the next thing they need to learn. Somewhere nearby, a 5-year-old was doing whatever 5-year-olds do in the evening, probably something chaotic and wholly unsentimental, which was the best possible thing. He thought about his father's handwriting on that small piece of paper, the loose, failing letters, the instruction given not to a company or a system, but to a son. Find a way to repay her. He had found her. The repayment was ongoing. It would be ongoing for a long time, and it would never be complete. Not because the debt could not be discharged, but because the lesson underneath it was not about debt. The lesson was about what you owed to the existence of someone who, in the middle of the night, with their own life waiting for them, made a choice to stay. Marcus Hale had spent 30 years building a system to make the world work more efficiently. He was going to spend whatever came next trying to understand what efficiency was actually for. He got in the car before he got the parking ticket. He drove home through the amber city with the window cracked and the night coming in, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he did not pick up his phone.